magnet, stick a magnet in the water to pull those heavy metals up. I'm concerned that behind this dam, being there 70 years, the other one's there over 80, talk about new the environment, how things are going to be. I applaud you for saying you're going to make a decision. I hope it's a real, look decision about what you're going to do. Saying that you can't have a power plant there under that statute is wrong, because they do it in other parts of our state, and they do it very fluently.
Did you have a question?
So, we want to get to the question whether or not you're going to, we didn't have this kind of thing over there. They got ready to take the dam out. If he does half of what he says he's going to do, that company, you guys will be on the map fairly decently. And I applaud if that's what you're going to do.
Sure.
But I know that I've heard some of the names you're talking about, historical people involved. In 3 months over there, I showed them stuff that they should have never touched.
Yeah. So he brings up a good point as far as one of the big questions and concerns, obviously, is the sediment behind the dam. There's stored sediment that is basically, instead of processing through the system, has gotten backed up behind the dam. And that's a very good question. And anytime you talk about dam removal, that's probably one of the most important things that you can discuss is how, first of all, is it contaminated? Because a lot of times what happened in these historically was that there was a lot of mining and placer mining, and a lot of heavy metals would actually go down the river, and they would actually deposit in this reservoir area and drop out and be there and contaminate the groundwater, essentially. We're dealing with this on the Milltown Dam removal in Montana, where it was over 6 million cubic yards of contaminated sediment, and it was all heavy metals. And it was actually contaminating the groundwater for the surrounding area, and putting the people at risk because of the groundwater. So since things like that have happened, and since we have that history and understand that, a lot of requirements are required of us as far as when we go through and do look at pulling a dam out, so to speak, to analyze and determine if the sediment is contaminated. And so that's already a large chunk of that process has already been done for the Golden Ray Dam. And what happened is Southern Oregon University and HDR Engineering here as well worked together, and they actually went out and took core samples throughout the reservoir area upstream of the dam. I believe around 20 core samples where they actually drill down, take a sampling of the sediment, pull it out, take it back to a lab, and it's analyzed for the different possible pollutants or contaminations that could be in there. This information is then subjected to what's called a sediment evaluation framework, which is a regulatory body that the Army Corps actually uses for dredging. So like if you go dredge the Columbia River, there's contaminants in there, and so they have to be analyzed and dealt with properly. And so there's a board basically that consists of a lot of the regulatory agencies like Army Corps and Division of State Lands, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, all these different agencies. And they are actually the ones that review this information. And there are thresholds and requirements that if you meet a certain contaminant level above background level, basically that's in the system, then you have to treat the sediment. You can't just blow the dam up and let the sediment go. You actually have to take the sediment out of the system and treat it and get it away from the water source, basically. And so the initial document has been prepared, the corings have been done, the analysis has been done, and there were specific contaminants that were found, but they were within kind of that background level that the Rogue River has in it already. And so the report was developed and submitted to this body to review, and that's where it's at right now, is that basically they're reviewing it, and they'll make a decision whether or not the science was correct and the information was correct, and then they'll determine if the sediment is okay to let it be released downstream. So that process is in place, it's moving. You can't just yank a dam and let the sediment go without analyzing the sediment. So,
take 3 more questions. Right here.
Yeah, right now, the measurements you've taken on these wetlands are going to change dramatically as the year wears on. In February, you're more than double what you measured today. You won't be landing that boat on that dam. You'll be clear up top of the pillars and more
right.
through. So above the dam, your little measurements are going to be small compared to February.
Right, so that's a really good question. So it starts raining, you know, and then we're starting to get rain now.
Everything comes up.
Water's gonna start coming up, obviously, in areas that are not wet today. I mean, it's basically about as dry as it gets out there today. Areas that are not wet today are going to be. And you're gonna have water ponding in areas that you don't have today. And so how can you go out there today and make a decision on what you think is wetlands or not? Well, remember I told you there's 3 criteria that an area has to meet before it can become a wetland. It has to have the right soil type, which is a hydric soil. It has to have the right vegetation, which is a hydrophytic vegetation, and it has to have the right hydrology or water. And so what happened in our initial findings and going through there is that one of those criteria was not met in about 75% of the area, and that's vegetation. There just wasn't wetland vegetation there. There were a lot of blackberries and grapes. Those aren't wetland indicators, so to speak. And so it becomes very quick to rule out some areas because they have to have all 3. It's not one of the 3, but all 3 of those items. And then the other thing that a lot of the areas didn't have was the right soil types. They didn't have hydric soils. And so it very quickly starts to fall out. And if you spend much time out there and walk through there, it's pretty easy visually to pick up as well. Because you can go through the areas that are blue on that map. You go through the reed canary grass and kind of the ash swales, and it becomes, wow, this is kind of boggy out here, and the vegetation and everything kind of screams out at you, wetland. And then you go through some of those other areas, you can't get through it because there's so many blackberry bushes and other things, and those just aren't, you know, wetland areas. So it's a good question.
Scott, can you just talk a little, just for a minute about wetland delineation and who determines that? I mean, is it just your scientists' opinion on what's a wetland, or is there some criteria?
Right, so there is a manual. The Army Corps puts out a manual for doing wetland determination, so it's a very strict guidelines on how that is to be done. You have to actually dig soil pits, identify soils, the vegetation, you have to key out the vegetation, and the hydrology or the water, you have to do that as well. And what happens a lot of times when you're doing this is that you run into the problem that you're talking about there where, hey, there's no water here, but I'm here in August in the Rogue Valley. Of course there's not going to be any water. And so they have specific criteria of when the water has to be there. And it's during what they call the growing season, typically around spring break is where I always remember it. So like in March, April, and those time periods. And you have to have that water there for a certain amount of time before it can be classified. And so that's usually the hardest thing to do if you're trying to do a wetland determination today. But in this case, because of, like I was talking about, the vegetation was just so obvious and it didn't meet the vegetation requirements, it immediately kicked it out of whether or not it's a wetland. So once this information is collected, a report is submitted to 2 agencies. There's a state and a federal agency that regulates wetlands. There's the Division of State Lands here in the state for Oregon, and then there's the Army Corps, and that's the nationwide regulation. And so you've got the state and federal. We submit our report to them. They look at it, kind of our science and our determination, and then they make a decision. That's what I was talking about on whether or not they agree with our science or not. And it's usually pretty cut and dry on a case like this. So that's basically where we're at right now, is that the information has been collected, our determination has been made, and we will continue to submit to the Army Corps and Division of State Lands. So.
A couple more questions, and I appreciate those last 2 questions, because the sediments and the wetlands are very hot issues that there's a lot of discussion and questions around. So a couple more questions there. Here, and then we'll go over here.
What I was wondering about is what agencies have to do permits on this to allow this to be done?
Okay, so there's really...
All of them.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question because it's very confusing. But I'll give you kind of the overview as far as the permitting process if we were to remove the dam. Again, getting back to there's a local level, the county, then there's the state and the bigger body, and then there's the federal. And they all don't always agree, obviously, on how things should be done and when they should be done and things like that.